So we're at concept 3.1, and I'll read the heading there. British attempts to assert tighter control over its North American colonies, and the colonial resolve to pursue self-government led to colonial independence movement and the Revolutionary War. So when you hear British attempts to assert tighter control in this time period, what are some of the terms and ideas that we could talk about?
Benign neglect.
Benign neglect, and then the ending of that policy, or salutary neglect. What is it neglect of? Benign neglect of what? Would be one example. A law that had been on the books for a long time, but it was being neglected benignly.
So they were trade.
Yep. Starts with N.
Navigation.
Navigation laws that were part of the mercantilist approach of the home country, mother country supplying all the finished goods, colony supplying all the raw materials. So that's the background for colonial independence. These colonies had left England, in the early 1600s, at least the initial ones, and because of distance and because of who they were, the Puritans were always independent-minded to begin with. That's the whole point of being a Puritan is, they wanted their church structure to be congregational and not that pyramid of top-down. And so they already have kind of independence written in their DNA. It's not surprising that they are the ones who are going to be the most ardent for independence.
What's the difference between benign neglect and salutary?
There's a time period difference, but I don't think other than that, so they talk about it benignly earlier, I believe, than but it really functionally is no difference. Yeah. All right, so the desire of many colonists to assert ideals of self-government in the face of renewed British imperial efforts led to a colonial independence movement and war with Britain. So what is Britain after? Why are they ending benign neglect? What has changed?
They had a war and they needed money.
They had a war. What's that war?
French and Indian War.
French and Indian War. Do you remember, if you were here last time, the name of the English minister who spent deeply and widely to win this war? He has an interesting name that's easy to remember. So one of the things, when England was in a hole of debt,
William
Pitt. William Pitt was the guy's name. All right. A, the imperial struggles of the mid-18th century, as well as new British efforts to collect taxes without direct colonial representation or consent, and to assert imperial authority in the colonies began to unite the colonists against perceived and real constraints on their economic activities and political rights. And so here you see some examples of their coming together, right? These pan-colonial conferences, Stamp Act Congress, First and Second Continental Congress, and then committees of correspondence. These ununited colonies who, historically have not really dealt with each other a whole lot, don't necessarily like each other in some cases very well. Now they have a common enemy. And so as we see across this time period, there's more and more interest of meeting together. So by the end of the Second Continental Congress, we finally have the full complement because at each one, a certain number of the colonies show up. And you could tie that to perceived feeling of threat or threat of perceiving of an emergency condition. What does it say? What do you mean against perceived and real constraints? What could you say about that? Perceived and real. What would be a real constraint on their trade? An obvious one.
The navigation acts.
Yeah, those navigation acts, right? Taxes could be considered that. Now, here's maybe we're going to perceived, because the colonists were perceiving a great threat here. If you looked at it in just strict numbers, the colonists are paying fewer and less taxes, less in total tax, than their counterparts in England. But what's different about this is that these are a new variety of taxes. They have been for so long been used to running their own show through either imperial malfeasance or incompetence, probably a better word, or the fact that they've got the English Civil War going on, and so they're busy in other ways. So these colonies get used to this idea of kind of running their own show, and then the distance also necessitates it. And then when England starts to enforce rules that have been on the books, old rules, the colonists perceive this as restraints, even though those restraints are always really there. And in theory, at least, they didn't have a problem with this. But they're upset about being treated like children. That's kind of some of the ways that they put it. They also start using the S word, which is kind of ironic.
Slavery.
Yeah, they say this is like slavery. And of course, the British, Edmund Burke, a famous British parliamentarian, he writes this really stinging rebuke of the American colonists. He says, "Oh, yeah, tell us about slavery. I hear you know all about slavery, right? Really kind of getting under the skin." All right. B. Colonial leaders based their calls for resistance to Britain on arguments about the rights of British subjects, the rights of the individual, local traditions of self-rule, and ideas of the Enlightenment. And so I've got there John Locke, rights of man, the social contract, inalienable rights, life, liberty, property, as Locke says. Jefferson will later change that to pursuit of happiness. The argument between Hobbes and Locke, do you remember that one from West Civ? Hobbes says the social contract cannot be renegotiated. That's when a group of people give power to either a king or a group of rulers, that you can't take that power back. Hobbes assumes that people are bad, they're irrational, they're always after their own self-interest, and you have to keep a tight lid on people like that. Locke assumes that people are generally good, rational actors, who, though acting in their own self-interest, don't do so to the extent where the community starts to fall apart. And his focus really is on people temporarily give over their power to leaders. And if those leaders violate some of those natural rights that the Enlightenment guys were talking about, life, liberty, property, and do it consistently, then people can take back that power. Now, the most extreme example of this would be obviously a revolution, like a coup d'etat, or an overthrow. But what would be more formalized, regularized ways of doing this? That we do, this year, especially. Yeah, elections. It's a way to keep temporary power. Looking ahead, what are the British saying about this? What's the British perspective on the colonists and their actions and their feelings? What would the British say to the colonial charge? No taxation without representation.
Oh, we are virtually.
They say you guys are virtually represented. We would say you guys treat us like children and slaves.
You guys have slaves of your own.
Yeah, you guys have slaves of your own. And the other one was, well, you are colonies and we are the mother country, and that's kind of the way it works, and it's kind of accepted the world round. And after all, you are British, and we are the most advanced civilization, and you guys aren't asking not to be British, right? And the colonial response would, no, we love being British. How do we know that relationship, at least on a cultural level, is still pretty strong? That the English, even though in their complaints about the taxation, and I'll give you a hint, specifically the stamp tax, the earliest one.
Oh, when they repealed stamp tax, we set up the, oh shoot, that's Statue of King George, right?
What's that?
When they repealed the stamp tax,
Yeah, what do they do?
they set up the Statue of King George.
Yeah, yeah, they put up a statue and they say, "Hurrah, huzzah, King George." The British would say, even with these taxes, like later on the tea tax, this is a small tax. We are selling you tea even cheaper than you could get it through smuggling. And of course, they're not seeing the American perspective is that this is not about dollars and cents. Actually, this is about principles. You know, we don't agree with the principle. Now, there is one British group that is sympathetic to the colonists. One significant British group that says, yeah, these colonists are onto something when they're worried about the power of the monarchy getting too strong and overcoming elected voices. There's one group in England that later on opponents of Jackson will remember. It's a party.
The Whigs.
The Whigs. Yeah. A group called the Whigs. They're monarchists, meaning they're not Republicans. They're not like going to try to overthrow the power of the king. But they're worried about the king is starting to grab more and more power at the expense of Parliament. Where we've seen that before. Where have we seen the battle between Parliament and the king before? What's that? Well, over religion, yeah. And I'm thinking about the English Civil War, the 1640s, that impacted the colonies. So this is something that the British people have on their minds. They're understanding it. They know it. All right. So let's move on to C. The effort for American independence was energized by colonial leaders such as Benjamin Franklin. Notice a specific term. What does that mean? Yeah, and you got to know them. As well as by popular movements that included political activism of laborers, artisans, and of women. What would be an example of political activism? Well, you see that Sons of Liberty and Sam Adams, certain tarring and feathering missions, non-importation you see there, or the homespun movement, protests in the streets, like a certain famous protest in the street turned violent by laborers, but not violence by laborers necessarily, although, maybe. Yeah, the Boston Massacre in 1770. We see women mentioned there. They become important players in the revolutionary movement. One of the ideas connected to them is this idea of Republican motherhood, and we'll talk more about that later. Benjamin Franklin, so we got to know about him. We talked a fair amount about him. Who is he? Where does he come from? What are some of the things we mentioned about him?
He was poor.
Mm-hmm. He was like the seventh son of a soap maker or something like that. Soap making not being one of the more noble professions, and the seventh sons, in this time period, those younger sons, the status goes down and down and down and down. He, in his autobiography, he basically, he talks about his older brothers that one particular older brother that he's kind of forced to work for is kind of, it's almost like a master-slave relationship. He actually runs away from him to make his own way. He's sometimes called the first American. So he has very lowly beginnings, but how does he rise to prominence? Through a huge inheritance? No. In the quintessential American way. And what is that? Working hard. Luck and pluck. Rising on your own skills and ability. Why is this possible? Well, in America, at this time, and today too, even actually more so today, you rise in a system of meritocracy, right? So it's not an oligarchy, it's not an aristocracy. It's a place where even somebody from humble beginnings, if they are lucky enough, if they apply themselves enough, if they have the right mix of skills, they can rise. When he goes to Europe, because he eventually becomes a diplomat ambassador, he's the most famous American on the planet. People love him. But he notices, people love him, especially in France, but in England, he notices that even though he's invited to a lot of parties, he feels the disdain because he's an Anglophile. He loves Britain. But you ever hear the phrase, familiarity breeds contempt? So he hangs out with British people. He thinks he loves British people. And then when he hangs out with real British people and he sees their snootiness and they're locked in this class system that's pretty permanent, he's really shocked by it. And then, there's a bit of pride there too, because there's a little bit of, hey, I'm thinking Ben Franklin, pay me some respect. And he's not feeling he's getting the respect that he deserves. He misses America. He comes back to America. He talks about how the fact that in America, even the simplest person can live well in a tidy home and provide for himself, whereas the poor in England are really poor, destitute. And why is that? Because their system is locked, right? Where did we first come across the idea that a British colonist to the Americas start to get changed in that way? Where did we first notice this?
Wasn't that thing, it was like people started dressing like
Yeah.
different classes and everything?
Right, yeah, so people started dressing above their social status, which in traditional English society is not accepted due to these sumptuary laws. But they have to pass these laws and enforce them in Boston because people are getting wealthy enough to kind of maybe dress above their station. And that's still a new enough idea, right? Okay. D, in face of economic shortages and the British military occupation of some regions, men and women mobilized in large numbers to provide financial and material support for the Patriot movement. One great example of this, and the note is their response to the Boston port closure. The Boston port closure was part of what series of punishments that the British imposed on Boston, Massachusetts Bay Colony? It was punishments for the Tea Party.
Intolerable acts?
The colonists called them intolerable acts. The British called them coercive acts, coerced to force. So the Boston port closure was one. A new kind of more harsh quartering act was another. They severely limited the functioning of the Massachusetts legislature, their General Assembly. And so in response to the fact that Boston's port was being closed, they're basically kind of under economic siege, basically. Surrounding colonies as far away as the Carolinas start sending supplies to the Bostonians. Now this is interesting, remember, because we're still at a time where these colonies don't interact with each other a whole lot. They might see themselves even as competitors. They might see themselves as each other as potential evil. In the case of the strict Puritan mindset. But here we have common cause, right? And so these other colonies start sending supplies to the Bostonians to help them get through. So they're starting to see this common enemy. All right, E, despite considerable loyalist opposition, the rule of thumb at the time, I think this was Franklin's rule of thumb, was a third, a third, a third. A third for the revolution, a third against, and a third seeing which way the wind blows. Other scholarship says that maybe the loyalist population is as high as 20%. And it varied from region to region, but loyalists were everywhere. Patriots were more concentrated where, do you think? Most heavily?
Boston.
Yeah, New England area, Boston. Now, obviously, there's patriots down in Virginia because, hey, Patrick Henry and George Washington and many other prominent Virginians are patriots. The general rule of thumb, although with lots of exceptions and outliers, is the further south you go, the more the loyalists, more the concentration of loyalists. In fact, that's how the revolution actually gets fought. It starts in Boston, and the British start moving it lower and lower and lower, or it's more and more south, thinking that, hey, we'll have more support, and they're partially right. There are more loyalists down there. But another interesting thing happens is when the British start moving their base of operations, they're first in Boston, and then they move to New York, and then they keep moving down and down and down. They are right, there are more loyalists down there, but many of the people down there were loyalists because these Bostonians, they're hotheads, and what are they complaining about? And then when the British Army shows up, some of them are going, oh, that's what they're complaining about. I don't like this either. And so the army goes south, hoping to find friends, and they end up making enemies of people that were maybe sympathetic. One of the ways that they did this is, the army's marching through and they get hungry, they see a farm, and they procure supplies from the local farmers, and maybe don't compensate fairly or at all. This is not. And so what you've done is you've turned a person who was loyal to the king, and now you see the king's representatives carting your pigs and chickens away. It's not so good. So some of the items there: Minutemen at Lexington and Concord. That's the shots heard around the world. 1775, soldiers began to die. Right. Bunker Hill, important because this is actually a British victory, but a Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrhic is a reference to a Roman general who won but paid huge, heavy cost. Right, so something like 2,000 casualties. The British finally take the hill, but they'll only hold Boston for another year, and then they evacuate Boston when the colonists they've raided Fort Ticonderoga, and they get all the cannon, and they set up the cannon around the city of Boston. Boston's a bunch of series of hills, and the British wake up one morning, they look up, oh, they're surrounded, by cannon, and so they leave for New York. Saratoga. Often considered a turning point. Some historians say that's been overemphasized, but you won't get penalized for saying it. That after Saratoga, the French are always kind of looking on the sidelines, kind of interested in what's going on. And of course, they've got a beef with Britain because they lost badly in the French and Indian War, and they're looking for a little bit of payback, right? And then some foreign support. De Grasse, Lafayette, von Steuben, two Frenchmen. De Grasse is an admiral, so he is kind of representing the French Navy. Lafayette, the French Army. Von Steuben is a Prussian officer. Oh, and we can't forget, of course, in Chicago, who can't we forget? A holiday we never take off, but all your public school friends do. Yeah, Casimir Pulaski. If you can write him down there. My goodness, I'm embarrassed that I forgot to write that down. So that's E. All right, let's do maybe one more page. You guys up for one more page? All right, and then we can be done. All right. So the next one here, I'll scroll down a bit. The American Revolution's democratic and republican, note a small r. What are republican ideals? Two things we talked about republican ideals. Now, obviously this is a long time ago, but what does it mean to be republican, small r? It's a type of democracy. Athens had a direct democracy. It was not a republican style democracy. It was a representative democracy. So that's kind of the practical, structural definition. What is the ideological definition of Republican? If you're a Republican, you believe what about your responsibility as a citizen?
Like sacrifice.
Yeah, sacrifice for the greater good. Or as Spock from Star Trek would say, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or one. But nobody knows that. The ideals that inspired the revolutionary cause reflected new beliefs about politics, religion, and society that had been developing over the course of the 18th century. A. Enlightenment ideals and philosophy inspired many American political thinkers to emphasize individual talent. What is that called? Starts with an M? Meritocracy. And our great example of meritocracy and the effects of it, BF. Ben Franklin, excellent. Individual talent over hereditary privilege, while religion strengthened American views of themselves as a people possessed with liberty. Again, John Locke. First Great Awakening. How does the First Great Awakening talk about religion and talk about politics? How can you talk about the First Great Awakening and bring both of those spheres together? What did the First Great Awakening allow people to do?
Challenge, like the leaders.
Yeah, and which leaders first?
Church.
They're church leaders. But of course, in the Anglican system, ultimately the king is the head of the church, right? The Puritans, by leaving, had already been the first rebels against that. Now they would say, and they would fight you if you said otherwise, they would say, we're loyal British, we love British society, we just, love our God more than the Anglican Church, So if you can question your religious leaders, and the First Great Awakening also emphasized the individual's free choice. So it's very individualistic philosophy, and so that's why the First Great Awakening and the Enlightenment, sometimes we put them as opposites. One focused on science and human reasoning, one focused on, getting right with God again. They both emphasize the individual and the individual rational mind. On the one hand, the individual rational mind to accept salvation and follow God, the free will to choose or reject God's ways. In the Enlightenment, to trust your own judgment, right? And to use your own observations to figure out the world. So there's an overlap there. And then the Declaration of Independence, some of these new ideals, all men are created equal, and we spent a lot of time at least picking through the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, the introduction and preamble. All right, colonists believed in the superiority of Republican forms of government based on the natural rights of people found expression in Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the Declaration of Independence. What is the chief argument in Common Sense? What does Paine say makes common sense? Well, to rebel, yes, but more fundamentally, to declare independence. And he gives all these arguments about why they should declare independence. One of the more poetic ones is how can an island rule a continent? He said, and then they're so far away, and you have your own ideals, and the king is being abusive of your rights. Prior to this, the colonists' problems were not with the king. Who are they with?
Parliament.
They're with Parliament. But then finally, Common Sense was written in January of 1776, and he says, come on now, all this hemming and hawing, having the rifle in one hand and the olive branch in the other, this makes no sense. What makes sense is you got to drop that olive branch, grab that musket, fight for your independence. And then in July, obviously, they do. And then in December of the same year, 1776, Paine comes back with his sequel, American Crisis it's called, and he says, okay, you've done it, but now don't give up, because 1776 was actually a pretty rough year for the Americans, and didn't look good for their cause. All right, C, during and after the American Revolution, increased awareness of inequalities in societies motivated some individuals and groups to call for the abolition of slavery, greater political democracy in the new state and national governments. You see this principle among the Quakers. They have this inner light idea. The spirit of 76, so it's in the northern colonies, particularly in New England. They really take these revolutionary ideals to heart, and many of them extend it to African Americans. D, in response to women's participation in the American Revolution, Enlightenment ideas and women's appeals for expanded roles, an ideal of Republican motherhood gained popularity, called on women to teach Republican values within the family, granted women a new importance in American political culture. And I think one of the greatest examples of this would be Abigail Adams, also Lucy Knox, Henry Knox's wife, who was Henry Knox was a prominent general. And then the whole series of letters, and then the one phrase that we remember from Abigail Adams is "Remember the ladies." Almost done here. E. The American Revolution and the ideals set forth in the Declaration of Independence reverberated in France, Haiti, and Latin America, inspiring future independence movements. So the French Revolution of the late 1780s, 1790s. And then there was a Haitian slave uprising, the first and I believe only successful slave uprising, where they grabbed control of the country themselves, led by Toussaint Louverture. And we'll stop there.